Kixeye has released a new defender hull, the Cloud Cruiser, and you might want to keep this one stationary to avoid any impacts to your range ring. Hey everyone, Derpy here, and welcome back to another Battle Pirates video. Taking a look at the builds document, which I'll show you how to find the Kixeye hash code in shortly, I want to give a huge thank you to the channel members for supporting the channel. They're making videos like this one possible, and if you want early access to videos like this one, click the join button below the YouTube video. Let's go ahead and take a look at the build in the Defender section for this, the Cloud Cruiser. If you want to have these hash codes, all you have to do is copy and paste them, Control-C, open up your shipyard, click share, press load, and paste it in with Control-V, pressing load for it to load it in at the end there. That's how you can get the Kixeye hash codes. I go over that once in a while because a few people don't quite remember it. Let's take a look at the stats for the Cloud Cruiser because there are a few interesting things you're going to want to be aware of. First of all, it does have 16 million armor points. This compares to other defender hulls like the Tarjan that have 14.5. It is a little bit higher, not really noteworthy. It used to be, we got a lot more differences even within the same tier in the past. The defenses are interesting. Ballistic against the Baron is 40%. Radioactive against the Huntsman is very high at 85%. And concussive against the Tsunami is mediocre at 60%. Not a lot of explosive and penetrative, so I would not be surprised if the next Conqueror hull in the next event that replaces Bounty is going to be one of these two. Just something to consider. Combat speed initially of 8 seems pretty low, but let's wait till we get to the special abilities. The Joust Thrusters. This is really interesting, and I'll let it speak for itself, but this is a speed buff that accelerates the hull as it keeps moving. It has a duplicate or a cap of 2, so you might only want to have 2 Cloud Cruisers in your base and mix it up with some other defenders for the rest. This plus 800% combat speed means you can go 9 times as fast, which is really interesting. You also lose your turn speed, basically you're not going to be able to move at all, so you want to have this lining up in front of a gate right behind a long channel to have this thing charging at enemy ships. I'd be curious if some really fast Conquerors can actually have this thing go by them completely and outrun this ship, so it seems like a potential negative. Interestingly, there is also a self-range modifier of 30%, which means that if the ship is moving, its range is going to be reduced by 30%. That's something you want to consider when you're determining if you want the ship to be able to move or if you want it to be completely stopped. Now that is the first special you want to consider, which is the engine. Do you want the ship to move or do you want it to be stationary? Moving, you're going to want to go with the Vanquish Engine CO, and stationary, you're going to want to go with Stalwart Sentinel Engine 3. I think that Vanquish Engine CO in a moving ship is likely the best one, at least to have 2 of these in your base, although I can definitely see some situations in which a stopped ship with longer range may do better, so I'll show you that build as well. Now that's the engine I'm going to put on, and by the way, special slot 6 will be different depending on the, or 5 rather, will be different depending on the engine that you are using. Taking a look at the weapons, because that will inform the rest of the build, as with most ships these days, there's really only one choice, which is the weapon that came out with the ship, which is the Beacon Scattergun. Note that the range here is 107, which compares to some other recent ranges, which let's take a look here at the Tsunami, has a range of 94, and the Wildcat for the Huntsman has a range of 106. If I take a look at the Baron Cannon, which you can mess around with range a whole bunch on this because it's ballistic, that has a range of 62, doesn't tell you a lot because you're going to boost it with some plus 50% ballistic range stuff anyway. But I do want to keep the Wildcat launcher range in mind because this will come up quite a bit with the Huntsman. Okay, let's go ahead and install the Beacon Scattergun and put 3 of these on the ship. Now what you'll notice with this is it has splash, which is pretty normal for a scattergun, and it also has a multi-shot of 3. How multi-shot works is if I have a multi-shot of 3, and these things are each doing, call it 40,000 damage, and I add plus 2 multi-shot, it's now going to give me 2 more projectiles that are also doing 40,000 damage. Without having deflection in the game anymore, this can be really, really powerful. Now this does have a DOT special ability, which is a little hard to see when I'm zoomed in all the way. I don't really think that this is worth going for here. You could boost this with supercharge and a bunch of stuff like that, and maybe I'll get into that in a different video, but I think just boosting the pure damage will be the best way to do this one, because the interval is every 1 second, which is usually 0.2 seconds. A few things to consider on that. I'm going to ignore that for this video because it's likely better to just to increase raw damage. If you have a few other thoughts, maybe there's another video on that one. Taking a look at special slot, we're going to number 2, we're going to actually boost the multi-shot, and the best option for that is actually going to be the corrosive diffusion system. For PvE, there are a few other choices because there can be assault class stuff equipped. For this one, +3 multi-shot and actually almost cutting your reload time in half is really, really powerful. We could look at something else that has a multi-shot of 2 and scattergun reload, combat speed. There's all sorts of other scenarios to look at, but the multi-shot of 3 on this does make it pretty powerful. I like this one. I think it's a pretty clear no-brainer. Taking a look, and by the way, multi-shot actually will increase the stacks for DOT as well. I told you I really wasn't going to increase that, but this is another advantage of special. Special slot number 3 is going to be a corrosive damage special. The best one in the game is currently compressed corrosion canisters 2, at least for a defender. This gives you +70% corrosive damage. And it's actually stackable with number 4, which is the assault battery MKCOM, which does a whopping 25% damage. I thought this was going to be a lot higher because a corrosive battery 3 is obviously super powerful, like 65%, but that's limited to assault only, so 25% is not super worth it. I could see an argument for supercharge instead of this one. Now the last special slot is something you're going to have to think a little bit about. Now I want you to think about how this will behave. It's going to be behind a gate, the gate's going to die, this thing's going to charge forward. It's going to be in range of enemy ships for a very short portion of its time, and closing range for a short portion of its time until it's directly on top of them. For that reason, I don't really care about range, and I care more about damage. Therefore, corrosive force is a pretty clear special for me on this one. Now the negative for this one is that when you're stopped, your range is now going to be below 100, which means that the Huntsman and the Wildcat launcher is going to outrange you when you're stopped. When you're moving, it's going to be even worse because you have that -30% debuff. Although again, you close the gap so quickly, I'm not really too worried about that one. So that is something for you to consider. If you keep getting outranged by people who snipe this out, you might want to remove force, changing it to scope if they're also using scope, or even just leaving it at a more neutral option like corrosive upgrade. A few people have been using something like the CTCO reloader on here, but the 45% scattergun reload seems pretty low, especially because I already have +10% on there, and the damage really just seems better to me. I could do an exact DPS comparison, although I think that this is not necessarily going to last long enough as a ship to be worth it. The initial strike might also be important, which makes damage pretty cool as well. So if you don't like messing around with range, I would personally suggest corrosive upgrade. If you want to decrease your reload time, there's nothing really too bad about that either. Obviously, it's not going to hurt you. Other options, again, also include something like supercharge if you really want to mess around with this, although I really said that I'm not going to do it too much. The 8x supercharge is pretty tempting here. Taking a look at the armors, which is the next thing we'll talk about before I talk about the potential change to force and the engine. Against the armors, I want to jump back to the defense on the ship. Ballistic is really low if people are hitting you with U1 Barons, which is really not the case today. Radioactive is very high, although people are still using the Huntsman, and Tsunami is medium, or concussive against the Tsunami is medium. Therefore, I'm going to recommend that you definitely put on 2 concussive armors, and that you consider putting on 2 ballistic to increase stat a little bit higher. Or if people are still hitting you with Barons, you should put on, or people are hitting you with the Huntsman, rather, is what I said. You should put on Radioactive against the Radioactive Huntsman. I would not be surprised if we had a new ship come out in the next conquest, the conquest after that, etc., that had a ballistic, or rather an explosive or penetrative attack. So just consider that when you're thinking about armors. Maybe leave these 2 blank and then put on whatever the next conqueror ends up being with this. There is the standard stationary build, but I do want to discuss briefly this was the moving one. I want to discuss the stationary one. The stationary one would be changing the Vanquish engine CO to be a Stalwart Sentinel Engine 3. Obviously, that gives the combat speed negative there. Now, the other thing that you want to consider is the corrosive force. You don't want to mess around with your range anymore. You don't want to decrease it because your range of 107 will now be less than 100, which is outrangeable by the Huntsman. Instead, what I'm going to recommend you do, so you can never get sniped by anything, is actually change this to corrosive scope, because that means even if a Huntsman has a scope on here, you can outrange him regardless and not have to worry about your range. So that's the consideration there for a ship which is stationary. I still think I planned for the moving ones, 2 of them personally. You might find something else that works better. If you have any thoughts on this build, go ahead and let me know in the comment section down below, and I'll do my best to get back to you. If you like videos like this one and want to support the channel, keep videos running, and have your name displayed on the end screen like the channel members are now, click the join button below on YouTube. With that said, and until next time, this is going to be Derpy signing out, helping you be a better pirate.